Hi, I'm Barb Tassel, and this professional development activity is focused at precepting, and it looks at the use of Benner's model of professional development to better understand the learning needs of the preceptee at each different developmental stage. On this slide, you will also see some information about a HRSA grant that has supported the development of this activity. So you might be thinking, what does stages of professional development even mean? This is a very robust model and can be used in many different aspects of nursing education. But since we're focusing on the role of the preceptor today, we will only be looking at the predictable stages that nurses go through as they progress from a student to a fully competent clinical nurse. Please remember, this is a developmental model. We're not talking about individual people's characteristics. We're talking about the progression as someone develops from one stage to the next. Benner's model was first introduced in research back in 1982. Since then, she's continued her research and refined and expanded the model. There are 5 distinct stages moving from novice to expert, and we're going to look at each of these in more detail and talk about what it's like, what you can do that's helpful and what you can do that's not helpful at each of these stages. The novice is typically thought of as a student, but this phase can also extend into the first 6 months or so of practice. Individuals vary, but think of this as someone who is still very focused on learning the how of what they need to do. They have no previous experience with a situation that they find themselves in. They typically do everything by the book, and that means they do it in order, and they're unable or refuse to adapt or to change that order. They just aren't able to. They need to go to work through step 1, then step 2, step 3, step 4, etc. They can't skip around those steps. They can't combine the steps yet. And sometimes people think that they are inflexible or that they're very limited in their thinking. And it's really not that they're inflexible as an individual. That's just where they are developmentally. They focus on the task at hand. They can be inattentive to other things going on around them. And this is really important for preceptors to remember. You may need to point out things that you want them to see or to think about. But remember, when you ask them to think about something else, they'll lose focus on what they're doing. For example, if you have a novice and they are doing something within a sterile field, they're thinking about that sterile field. They're focused on that task at hand. They might not even look up at how the patient's reacting to the procedure that's going on with them. And so you bring that to the student's attention. They take their focus off of the sterile field and start thinking about the patient and an assessment there, and they're going to very quickly contaminate that sterile field. They can't do both things at once. That's just not how they're able to focus at this point. They're also not able to prioritize tasks without rules. So prioritizing patient care tasks are very difficult for them. They need rules. So one way to think about that is to remind them about Maslow's hierarchy of needs. They can use that as a rule to help prioritize what needs to happen first, etc., within all tasks. And one of the most important facts for a preceptor to remember is that novices are unaware when they make mistakes. They don't know what they don't know. And so they need a lot of supervision until you are absolutely sure that they are completely knowledgeable and comfortable with that portion of care. So putting this into practice then, some things that are helpful and not so helpful when you are precepting a novice. So first of all, it is very helpful for you as the preceptor to think out loud. They need to hear your thoughts. They need to hear your critical thinking. It is also helpful for you to draw their attention to external happenings, external to what they're doing. Again, remember, when you do that, their attention will leave whatever it is they're doing. I also want you to think about how you approach them doing a skill. So you can talk about the skill, then allow them to do the skill, and then kind of go back and debrief after the skill. They could do the skill first, and then you talk about it afterwards. The important thing here is not to talk about the skill while they're doing the skill. They can't do both. They're not going to absorb what you're saying and be able to focus on the skill. And don't forget, they need that direct supervision. So things that are not helpful for novice: too much information at one time. Don't assume that they're competent. They've been checked off in school. They may have done this in the clinical setting a couple of times, but don't assume that they're competent. Stay with them, give them the supervision they need, give them the support they need. The next part about not being helpful is just having them do a skill without knowing why, or just telling them about it without letting them practice. Both of those things are very difficult. They need to have both. They need to be able to practice the skill, but they also need to hear the rationale behind the skill. And then the other thing is, don't talk down to them. Yes, they're students, but they're also adults. They have other experiences in life. So just because they don't know this doesn't mean that they don't have value and bring things to the table. So incorporating them as a colleague is much more helpful than talking down to them as if they were an elementary student. And sometimes that happens. So just wanted to put that one out there. So the next stage in this model is called the advanced beginner. And this is usually anywhere between 0 to 2 years of experience is considered an advanced beginner. We all know this is a high turnover time frame within the nursing career. And so I've highlighted in red some of the things that are going on with advanced beginners so that you have a kind of a cue as to what might be contributing to that turnover. So I think it's really important as we look at this level of advanced beginner, not only to think about if you're an experienced nurse who's precepting someone who's in this stage. You just got a new hire transferred into your department and they're an advanced beginner. What is that like to precept them? But I also want you to consider the fact that we sometimes have to start using our nurses as preceptors while they are still advanced beginners. And again, I want you to think about what is happening in this stage of development that could be contributing to the stresses of this area and leading to turnover. So advanced beginners, some of the attributes of this stage are that they are task-focused, task-oriented. They are really not thinking about full clinical processes yet. They view each data collection or task independently, not quite seeing the big picture. They can recognize recurrent patterns, and they tend to be very competency checklist or schedule or list oriented. It helps them keep themselves organized. Their thinking is very deliberate and memorized because they really don't have a lot of experience to draw on yet. And I've noted that this can be very tiring. So I want you to think about the last time that you drove on a new road, possibly not the best road conditions, maybe bad weather. You weren't familiar with where you were at. I know for myself, I get in the situation, I need to turn the radio off. I don't want people talking. I need to really concentrate on the road. That is an example of deliberate thinking. You know, when you're out on a freeway and it's sunny and it's bright and you've been down that road 100 times, you can relax because you know where you're going. You know what's around that next curve and you're not worried about it. But when you don't have that knowledge and that experience with that area that you're driving, then you have to really use deliberate thinking. And that can be extremely tiring. Advanced beginners use that style of thinking all the time. That is where they are developmentally at. And so it is mentally exhausting for them to complete a shift. Some other attributes are that they have trouble prioritizing. They still tend to go in order. They are still fairly rule-driven. Or they go with the squeaky wheel. They go with the colleague that is begging for the most help, the patient who is on the call light the most, the family member who is at the desk the most. And so again, they're not prioritizing the whole picture if they're going with the squeaky wheel. They also have difficulty adapting. They can get disorganized and they can stay that way if they don't have someone come alongside to help. Backing up to the top part, we were talking about their competency, their checklist, their schedule oriented. So when something changes, they kind of really need to have someone come alongside and say, okay, where are we at and what do we got to get accomplished today, and help them think it through so they can get back on that schedule orientation that they work off of. They have difficulty speeding up. And we all know that shift starts to go bad and we have to speed up. And in this stage, in the advanced beginner stage, that is really difficult for them. And they will kind of shut down and become very, very stressed by it. So now we have someone who is tired and extremely stressed, nearing a shutdown phase where they'll just kind of pull back and not be able to process anything for a little bit. And then at this stage, they still have difficulty multitasking. That is still one of the attributes of an advanced beginner. Also in this stage, they learn by imitation. They're not yet critically thinking through and doing things on their own. They're functioning because this is how they've seen someone else do it. They sometimes fail to validate their conclusions or their decisions before acting. Again, they don't have enough experience to know that they're wrong. They have more experience than that novice, but it doesn't always suit yet. And so they have trouble with the critical thinking side of it. They can be very self-focused. Sometimes this makes them distant from coworkers or patients. People will often say, I just can't get to know her very well. Again, don't think of this as individual attributes or individual characteristics, but they are so very self-focused because of that deliberate thinking that they're using that they don't do both. They don't have time to become buddies with folks yet, and they don't think about the social side of it quite as easily yet. They also lack some confidence, and that increases the anxiety level. If you're precepting an advanced beginner, they may have lots of questions. Even if you're not precepting, they could be off orientation, but they still have lots of questions because of that lack of self-confidence. Or on the other side, they might not ask enough questions. And sometimes you can even invite them, say, oh, you're always okay to ask me questions. I'm happy to help you. Or I like when you ask me questions. It helps me know exactly what you're thinking. But they still, because of the lack of confidence, they don't want to look wrong. And so they won't ask the questions. And they can also have difficulty with patient advocacy. They might not even step up and be an advocate when a patient's safety might be compromised. Again, it's that lack of self-confidence that they're just not sure they're right in thinking that way. They do, by this stage, have a heightened sense of responsibility, and that also contributes to the anxiety. So as you can see with the items in red on these two slides, there are several things that can contribute to a high turnover endpoint for advanced beginners as nurses progress through that first couple of years in practice. So if you are a preceptor, and you have an advanced beginner as the learner beside you, maybe you're a very experienced nurse and you've just got that new transfer in and that person is an advanced beginner. It is really helpful if you think out loud explaining each step that you're doing. Remember, they still don't have enough experience behind them to know it already, so they need to hear what you're thinking. It's difficult for them to multitask, so it's really, really difficult when you multitask. They need assistance. They need mentoring in setting those priorities and in reestablishing their organization for a shift. It's real helpful if they get constructive feedback so that they can reflect on what they're doing. The other thing that's helpful for them is to use cues or memory aids and to chunk learning into threes. And I'm going to help you understand what chunking is. I want you to try to remember the following number that I'm going to read. Okay, don't write it down, just try to remember it. 3, 6, 5, 2, 1, 8, 9, 7, 3. Let me read it again. No cheating, no writing it down. 3, 6, 5, 2, 1, 8, 9, 7, 3. That's a very difficult number to repeat back, isn't it? But let's see what happens if I chunk it. 365, 218, 973. Now I've combined some numbers there, but even if I don't combine them, even if I just say 365, 218, 973, it's easier for us to remember when things are chunked into threes. So anytime that you can use that when you're teaching someone a new process and they're an advanced beginner, it actually works for all of us. It will be very helpful. So some things that are not helpful when you're precepting an advanced beginner. Don't give them the super complex assignment that they have to multitask in order to do it. They can't comprehend that yet. They're just not ready. They need it broken down. It's also really unhelpful for them to see inconsistency. Remember, these folks still need rules. They still base things on rules. So if you say one thing and do the other, you're kind of breaking the rule, and that's very difficult for them. So, the do as I say, not as I do phrase really, really doesn't work for them at all. They're looking for those rules, that absence of doing the right thing. And then, of course, the sink or swim, we should never leave anybody out there to just figure it out on their own. And both with novices and advanced beginners, it actually becomes very, very dangerous when that happens. So the next stage in Benner's model is the competent practitioner, and this is someone who's been in practice for 2 to 3 years. I also want you to think about that this is the kind of the common area for many of our preceptors themselves to be in. But we're talking about precepting today. So I want you to think about if you have a learner who is in this stage of development. So these folks do tasks very accurately and very safely, and they recognize important differences between things. They can see the big picture. Sometimes they need help with processes or looking at outcomes, but they basically can see that themselves on an ongoing basis. They use intentional thinking and experiential learning, which means that they can do a lot of things automatically, but they also know how to just kind of stop and intentionally think it through based on their experience. They can prioritize by using that style of thinking. They have to think about adaptations. So again, they may pull back and take a breath and kind of think it through how to get the next step going. They're not extremely flexible, but because they do have to stop and think about adaptation still at this stage, but they can do it. They don't really multitask yet. They're faster at what they're doing. So from the outside, it might look like they're multitasking, but they're really not yet. And by this point in a career, they have high ownership feelings, and they feel very responsible for their patients and for their caseload and for their responsibility. I also want to talk about this stage just a moment because let's say that you have a new employee and you find out that this person has 2.5 years experience, and now they're transferring to your department, and it's a specialty type of department. And so you're thinking, good, they've got 2.5 years. We're just going to roll right through this. And your first couple of days, they're behaving more like a novice. And that is exactly what will happen. When a competent practitioner goes into a very new and very different field, they will go back to novice, and they will quickly progress from novice to advanced beginner back into competent. But I just wanted you to recognize that that's what is happening and kind of support them through that, and they'll come back to the competent level really fast. So when you are precepting someone who's a competent practitioner, they need you to discuss the process and the rationale. They need you to give very complete instructions and give them the expectations that they need to do. They want to focus on the patient goals and the outcome, planning and prioritizing care. So focusing on that is helpful for them. They really don't necessarily need a lot of guidance on skills unless it's something brand new and specialized, like those specialty type of departments. But otherwise, they're really thinking more about the planning and prioritizing care. However, they also need to be checked on. They kind of need to be protected a little bit. They don't need you there beside them every moment of the day, but they do need you to check on them and shelter them a little bit. So what is not helpful for this level of practitioner is to have inconsistency between the rules and reality. They also want to make sure that the area that they're working in is a caring environment. So if they don't feel like people care about them as an individual or care about the profession as a whole, that can really be a problem for this level of practitioner. They really want to see the whole picture, and they want to feel that caring environment. And Benner's model does go through the aspect that some professionals actually stall out here because they don't get that support and they don't feel that caring environment. And there's a lot of inconsistencies between the rules that are written but the reality that they see. They just kind of stop progressing to the next level of development, and they remain a competent practitioner. They're safe. They can do their job. but they just don't go on to those higher levels of functioning without that caring environment and good, solid, consistent practice around them. So the next level is the proficient level, and in this stage, the characteristics that you'll see are folks that are able to adapt to disruptions, and they can adapt to special cases well. They use critical thinking. They're very open. They're able to see multiple approaches to doing something. They can recognize the differences in something and know how to choose the best options. They do multitask, and they can articulate the processes and the rationale behind what they're doing. They are guided by evidence. They really want to use evidence-based practice. They function in an automatic way. Whenever it's a recurrent experience, something that they do over and over again, they have that intuition and automation for those functions. But they have to stop and think about new experiences and transfer the learning there. It's typical. And they can still get into time trouble with a lot of disruptions or extra work coming their way. So they kind of need to back off and think about it and get themselves reorganized in order to handle that. So when you are precepting that proficient practitioner who just transferred to your unit, it is helpful if you ask them to think out loud. They don't need to hear you think out loud like the advanced beginner and novice do, but you want to hear them think out loud because it helps you know what they're thinking. It helps you validate their thinking. They enjoy and need lots of experiences. They don't need low-level skills. And they need case studies to focus on the important factors in your area of practice, whatever specialty or whatever level that is. So again, they don't want, it's not helpful to focus on low-level skills, low-level knowledge. Again, they want to focus on the patient goals and outcomes. And following you around, not giving them a lot of experience is definitely a waste of their time. They're functioning way past that level. And finally, the fifth level in this model is the expert level. And you can basically say that most people are going to reach this by somewhere around 5 years of practice. These folks have extensive knowledge. They practice automatically or intuitively. They're very goal-centered. They respond to a wide range and subtle cues in the environment. And they can usually anticipate situations and kind of be ready for them before anybody else around them even knows it's going to happen. These are the kind of nurses that walk into a patient's room, 2 seconds later, they turn around and say, hey, can somebody bring the crash cart down the hall for me? And the patient hasn't made any change yet, but they see those subtle cues and react to them. So I'd like to do a little bit of comparison here. Preceptors are often experts. We often use those with the most experience to precept our newest employees or the students that we have in our areas. So experts are those who function by intuition based on their extensive knowledge and experience. Students, however, are novices. Sometimes advanced beginners are in this same realm of how they're thinking, and they need rules, and they're very often paralyzed without them. So those two don't necessarily match well. Experts have a hard time articulating each step that has to be done because they function by intuition and automatically do things. They don't think about what step comes before the next one. And so it's sometimes hard and frustrating for an expert to precept a novice. And so when you think about making assignments, maybe you're in a supervisory role and you need to think about making assignments for who would be the best person to precept this student. You might want to use that competent practitioner or that that proficient practitioner as the student preceptor and maybe not necessarily the expert. If you happen to have that expert transfer to your area or move to your location, some things that are very helpful for them is to give them the hospital practice and policies. Just talk about why we do it the way we do it here. Give them lots of experiences and expect them to move through orientation very quickly. Remember, you do have to complete competency checklists on them to make sure that they're doing things the way that your policies and procedures say so. but they really don't need skill-based checklists very much. And they really find it not helpful when an orientation is built so that it wastes their time and doesn't recognize the competencies that they bring with them. So as you think through these stages of professional development, either as a preceptor, when you're working with new folks or with students, or again, maybe you're the supervisor who's making the assignments for preceptors, I want you to think about your work with them and what might need to change based on what you've learned today to make sure that you're meeting the learner's developmental needs in the best way possible.